thank you for inviting me.
Professor Grover Furr is my guest today, and I would like to start by saying that it's a great honor for me to be able to talk to you today. As a communist activist for over 20 years, I am constantly dealing with an endless campaign of lies, slandering the communist movement and, above all, the first socialist state in the world, which was the Soviet Union. Comrade Stalin is particularly brutally attacked, and I am sad to say that this whole intense campaign of falsifying history is very effective, and millions of young Poles uncritically believe in it. The witch hunt atmosphere makes even Marxists afraid to discuss the history of the Soviet Union and capitulate to the anti-communist inquisition. The books you have written require tremendous courage, and on behalf of myself and the viewers of my channel, I would like to thank you very much for your great work in telling the story. In today's Poland, you would be a victim of a smear campaign, you would lose your job, fascist militias would attack you in the street, and perhaps you would even go to prison. Therefore, at the beginning, I would like to ask, what are the possibilities of scientific work in the USA?
Right now, let me put it this way. I teach English literature. And so my research on the Soviet Union has no relationship to my teaching job. So I'm able to do it. There aren't any restrictions on me. However, it is impossible to be a historian, let's say, teaching history in a history department in the United States, unless you are anti-communist and anti-Stalin. That's not because of the government, not directly. That's because the powerful forces in the history, in academic history, simply will not permit pro-communist, and particularly people who are seen as pro-Stalin, to have a career, to have a job teaching history in the United States. I call this the anti-Stalin paradigm. That paradigm means model. You have to follow the anti-Stalin model of history in order to get published, whether articles or books, and in order, in fact, to hold on to a job teaching history in the United States. But I don't teach history. I teach literature, so therefore it doesn't directly affect me. I could not teach history and do what I do today.
So we can say that all these Marxists and anti-capitalist intellectuals which are existing in the USA and other Western countries, if they not publicly criticize the comrade Stalin, they will never be published.
If they teach in the history department, yes, and certainly you can't have my books, for example, my research could not be published by academic publishers or mainstream commercial book publishers, by major publishers. And the articles that I have published are published by small left-wing journals. Even then, I often have trouble getting them published, but there are one or two that will accept articles from me. But that's right. If I taught in the history department, none of this would be possible. You can't have a job teaching history in the United States and be viewed as pro-Stalin or pro-communist, pro-Soviet. That's just not possible. On the other hand, there are quite a number of professors of history in the United States who are pro-Trotsky. And they call themselves communists, of course. But Trotskyist scholars are welcomed in the mainstream of the historical profession in the United States because they're anti-Stalin.
So the government of USA don't care about the spreading Marxist idea, talking about work class struggle in USA, but when somebody starting to talk about the experience of the first victory of the proletarian in the world, in the Russia, and creating Soviet Union, no, now it's starting to be dangerous. Now you need to speaking like us and be against the Bolsheviks, against Stalin.
Well, to some extent, you have to understand that the reason that it's easy for me to do what I do, I'm not persecuted certainly by the government, is because the left-wing movement, the communist movement in the United States was never very large. It was never anywhere near as large as it was in France, where you are, for example, or even in other European countries. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, after 1991, I think the U.S. government really stopped paying much attention to the organized communist groups in the United States because they're so small and they have very little influence. So in that sense, the communist movement in the United States has always been different from that in much of the rest of the world, including in Eastern and Western Europe.
And in the last year, when the special military intervention in Ukraine started, something changed or is the same?
It hasn't changed directly for me. I should say that I do get some harassment. I don't want to. I don't want to tell you that there's no consequences for me to do the research that I do, but it doesn't come from the government. I also teach in New Jersey, which is on the East Coast, the Northeast of the United States. Certainly, if for some reason or other I taught in some of the southern or western states, then there might be less toleration for the kind of research that I do and the kind of conclusions that I come to. But now, as for the war, the Russia war in Ukraine, this hasn't affected me, but it is it's remarkable how unanimous the not only the government's view of this war, but also within academia, let's say within departments of Russian or Slavic studies. They are all lined up on the side of NATO and Ukraine, and there's no questioning permitted, even in the academic world, about that. But that's about that. That's not about the Soviet Union, right? That's about NATO. It's about the United States, and so it doesn't impact me directly or the kind of research I do directly. Yes, the mass media compare President Putin to Stalin, but that's ridiculous, and I don't see that too many people take that seriously.
Yes, but it is funny because from the perspective of the Ukraine, now if everybody in the West love the Ukraine, they need also love Comrade Stalin because it is Stalin who give Ukraine the western part of this territory. Without him, without him, the Soviet Union didn't exist. So the first Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic will not exist. But also without him in the power in the time of the Second World War, there will be no taking land of the Lviv of this western part of Ukraine. So
Ukraine wouldn't be part of Poland. It wouldn't be part of Ukraine, or be part of Nazi Germany for that matter. Yeah, that kind of thing, it never gets discussed. Okay, there's been, there's some discussion of the historical background of Russia and Crimea. Crimea, was attached to the Ukrainian SSR, by Khrushchev in 1954. There's some very little, but a little bit of discussion about how the Donbass was also added to the Ukrainian SSR in the early 1920s. Very little, and the whole war is discussed in a completely biased and unscientific manner in the mass media, and also, for the most part, in academia. But again, this doesn't directly impact my research on the Stalin years, which, by the way, is mainly ignored in mainstream historical discussion in the United States. On the other hand, there are a lot of people, including many, many young people, who contact me, who are very interested in the research that I do, and interested in the what we might call the Stalin period of Soviet history. So, so there is a somewhat of an upsurge among younger people of interest in the history of the Soviet Union, the history of the communist movement, and I see this as a very positive development here in the United States, because it hasn't happened in a long time. And there's been somewhat of a decline of interest in Trotskyism, which is not surprising, because with the evidence that has come out of the Soviet archives, plus the evidence that's come out of the Trotsky archive at Harvard, the evidence is there that Trotsky really was a conspirator. He really was lying in almost everything he said. You could hardly ever believe anything the man wrote. And this is beginning to become better known among left-wing circles in the United States.
Before we move on the main topic of our conversation, which is the Katyń massacre, could you say a few words about other books that you have written? What were Khrushchev's greatest lies, and why does the West hate Stalin so much?
Well, yes, I wrote a book called Khrushchev's Lie. Khrushchev Lied. It has a different title in Russian, but that's really what it should have been called. Khrushchev Lied. And that was my first book, and that's a study of Khrushchev's famous secret speech that he gave at the 20th Party Congress in February the 25th, 1956. And to make a long story short, I decided to study that about 20 years ago. I began studying it in the light of documents from the former Soviet archives that were beginning to be published in Russia at that time, and became available also in the United States. And that's where I discovered that Khrushchev basically lied in every accusation against Stalin or Lavrentiy Beria in that speech. That far from being a historical source, which is the way it's always been treated by academic historians and others, it's completely unreliable. And what that did was got me thinking, well, if Khrushchev lied about this, and of course, Gorbachev and his people from 1985 to the end of the Soviet Union supported the falsehoods that were put out during Khrushchev's day. So therefore, they were probably lying too, or they might have been. And then Khrushchev, what Khrushchev accused Stalin of was similar to the kinds of things that Leon Trotsky had accused Stalin. So that suggests that it would be worthwhile to look carefully at Trotsky's writings in the light of the a vast amount of documents that we have from the former Soviet archives, and try to see if they could be verified, or we could show that that Trotsky and Gorbachev and his people were also lying like Khrushchev. And that's what I've been doing. What I have discovered is that the account of Soviet history that was put out by Khrushchev and his men under his time, and then by Gorbachev and his people during his period, it really falls. So I have endeavored to take a number of accusations of crimes by Stalin and investigate them in the light of the evidence that we now have, mainly, although not entirely, from former Soviet archives, and see what the evidence shows. And what it shows is that, at least what it's shown me so far, is that every accusation of crime against Stalin that I have investigated turns out to be false. I have yet to discover a single crime that Stalin actually committed. And that's, that was for a long time was surprising even to myself. And that continues to surprise and even shock many people.
I think that Stalin, he committed one crime, and this crime, it is, he didn't denazificated Ukraine, and a lot of banderists survive, and they now, all this problem in Ukraine is because the banderist movement survive in Ukraine.
Well, okay, I'm not a specialist in that, so I'm not in a position to say that you're completely wrong. But what happened with the Ukrainian nationalists who fought on the side of the Nazis is when the Germans were retreating, starting in 1944 and the end of 1943, the Ukrainian nationalists divided themselves into two groups. Many of them retreated, like Bandera, for example, and many of his followers. They fled, and they ended up getting asylum, getting jobs and political protection in Western countries like Germany, the United States, and especially Canada. And then others stayed in Ukraine underground and fought as terrorists. And that was a very serious war. That took place from the end of World War II up until sometime in the early 1950s. And the Ukrainian nationalist underground killed a great many people. And the MGB, the Soviet the Soviet forces of state security, fought a very bitter and costly war against the Ukrainian nationalists in the period after World War II up until the 1950s. By the way, something similar to that, as I'm sure you know, happened in Poland as well.
Yes, in Poland it's finished in 1947 with the action Wisła, when they deported 150,000 Ukrainians from the southeastern part to the lands which were taken from Germany. I talked about this question with Prime Minister Nikolai Azarov. He was Prime Minister of Ukraine from 2010 until putsch in 2014. And he responded in this question that Stalin make everything good, but after his death, Khrushchev, because Khrushchev was his wife was Ukrainian nationalist, she said to Khrushchev that you need to liberate these guys. So these guys were very quickly liberated, and some of them starting to make career in the Soviet party and also Soviet institutions. So it is very quick career that the guys who make guerrilla against the Soviet Union a few years later became the people who are working for the institution of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, and I believe, although you'll know more about this, I believe that Khrushchev did the same thing in Poland with Gomulka and the Polish nationalists who had either been imprisoned or at least were under surveillance. The ones who had fought on the side of the Armia Krajova, and there were also terrorist groups in Poland. Um, I haven't heard the story that you just mentioned about Khrushchev's wife, about Nina Khrushcheva. It could be, but I do know that many Ukrainian fascists came to Canada and the United States and were supported by the CIA and funded by the CIA until Ukraine became independent. What was it, 1991, I guess, 1990? And then they went back to Ukraine. There were some obviously older but well-known academic professors, for example, at various universities in the United States, who went back to Ukraine once it was independent, and they became very influential culturally, educational. Excuse me. For example, the whole story of the Holodomor, the deliberate famine, so-called, was really unknown in Ukraine until after Ukrainian independence. It was brought to Ukraine by the people who had invented it, who were these Ukrainian nationalists who had collaborated with the Germans. But then it rapidly became one of the foundation stones of contemporary Ukrainian nationalism. It's taught as a fact in Ukrainian schools and universities, even though there is no evidence to support it, and there never has been any evidence to support it. But that doesn't stop it from being taught. And I think that's a pretty amazing accomplishment on the part of the Ukrainian nationalists, that they have a great deal of influence in Ukraine, but not through the government, not through political parties, but culturally and educationally, and in the writing and rewriting of history. So I think that's pretty amazing. You mentioned Katyn, and I guess we'll talk about that in a minute. But see, there is some evidence of Soviet guilt in Katyn. Now, it's not good evidence, but there is the German report, and there are these documents that Gorbachev and Yeltsin supposedly discovered, and then Yeltsin gave them to Lech Walesa. You can't say that there's no evidence that the Soviets were guilty of Katyn. There is some, but there is no evidence that the Soviets deliberately starved the Ukrainian peasants, and there's no evidence of Holodomor. And yet it is taken as fact in Ukraine and elsewhere too, okay, as a way of demonizing Stalin and the Soviet Union. The main, I think, a principal effort on the part of the anti-communists uh, all over the world, is to try to say that the Soviet Union was like Nazi Germany, uh, communism is like fascism, like Nazism, and Stalin was like Hitler. And in Eastern European countries, like no doubt Poland, certainly it's the case in countries like Czechoslovakia and Ukraine. You can talk about Poland, though there are laws that make it illegal to to deny Nazi crimes or to display Nazi or fascist symbols, and the same laws make it illegal to deny Stalin's so-called crimes, Soviet crimes, and to display communist symbols. So there's this worldwide attempt to join these two things together, to say that communism is like Nazism, Stalin is like fascist. The Soviet Union is similar to Nazi Germany. There's even this position. I'm sure you know about this from Poland, and it's the case in Ukraine and in the Baltic states as well. That we were never liberated from the Nazis. The Red Army didn't liberate us. It was just one uh,
one occupant who changed another occupant.
One enslavement after another. Now, the Jewish population in these countries does not see it that way. There are researchers on the Holocaust in the Baltic states and in Poland who will insist that the Red Army did liberate us. But that's just the Jewish population. For the rest of the country, for the rest of the educational system and legal system, it's just declared that the Soviet Union didn't liberate anybody. It's absurd, right? If you think of all of the concentration camps, all of the death camps that the Red Army liberated, to take a position, and many of them were in Poland, as you know, to take a position that the Red Army didn't liberate Poland it's crazy. But that's the position that the government pushes, and children are educated to think this way. I would say that's a since the beginning of the Cold War, that's been a major theme of anti-communism, is trying to equate communism with Nazism and Stalin with Hitler. So if you're going to equate Stalin with Hitler, then you have to find some crimes that Stalin committed, right? Because otherwise, how are you going to equate Stalin with Hitler? So they go off and they invent, falsify various events of the Soviet Union to make them look like crimes of Stalin. And if you deny them, you can't get published, except in small left-wing journals or by small left-wing publishers, which is where those are the people who publish me. But in the mainstream, it's frozen out. You just can't say that. I have been told this. I know some historians, specialists in Soviet history in the United States, some really good people. And they have told me, two of them have told me, they've said to me, when I've shown them manuscripts of my books, I showed one of them a manuscript of my book, Blood Lies, which is a critique of Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands. I showed one of them manuscript, and he had some interesting, he had some good points to make here and there, not very much. But he said, Grover, you have to say bad stuff about Stalin. You have to say bad things about Stalin. No one is going to publish your book if you don't say bad things about Stalin. And my answer is, well, I'm not writing for the history profession. I'm not writing for the professional historians in the United States or in Europe or anywhere, because that's a corrupt field. They're not interested in the truth. They're interested in anti-communist propaganda. I'm publishing for people who want to find out the truth. Basically, I'm publishing and doing this research for people on the left, for people who are interested in communism and socialism and who want to know the truth about the communist movement of the past. But that's not the history profession in the United States or in Europe, not at all. Even in Russia, most historians have to be anti-Stalin. Although there is room for a small number in Russia of what you might call pro-Stalin historians, people who are not anti-Stalin. But outside of Russia, there's no room anywhere in any country. Maybe China. Okay, let's leave China aside. But leaving China aside, there's no room for a pro-Stalin. I mean, I'm regarded as pro-Stalin. I don't regard myself as pro-Stalin. I'm for discovering the truth. Okay, but I get called a Stalinist and being pro-Stalin if you tell the truth. If you disprove lies about Stalin's crimes and show that they're not really crimes, then you get called a Stalinist, and therefore, why should we pay any attention to you? Because you're not being objective. Actually, I try to be objective. So I reject the term Stalinist. I'm after the truth. And if Stalin committed any crimes, I've been saying this for years. If Stalin committed any crimes, I want to know about them. However, I have to say that after having done this for the last 15 or 16 years and written 14 books or so, done a lot of research, I would be very surprised at this point if I discovered any crimes of Stalin, because I think I've investigated all of the major accusations against Stalin, and most of the minor ones, including allegations of crimes that most people have never heard of. I've investigated a great many, and I've yet to find one that Stalin was actually guilty of. So I would be surprised at this point in my life if I discovered some real crime or other of Stalin. But I'm ready to discover it if the evidence is out there. Meanwhile, I have to say that I have not discovered a single crime that Stalin committed. And you can't say that in academia. You just can't say that. You can't get into the mainstream news media. You can't write an essay for the New York Times or for any other major newspaper or for a magazine for general circulation. That's out of the question. And most so-called left socialist publications will not publish it either. They'll publish Trotskyists, praise Trotsky.
You said one thing which I am not agree. You said that you are writing your books for the left and communists. No, the left hate you. The left social democrats hate you, so they hate you more than the right-wing anti-communists.
Yes, the social democrats hate me. You're quite right. That's true. So, when I say the left, I don't mean them. But there are many young people here in the United States, more than you'd think, perhaps, that are really interested in the history of the Soviet Union, and a lot of them contact me, and then they also contact each other. But yes, outside of the United States, when it comes to Europe, there are the remnant. Well, people like yourself, who are lifelong communists. Some of them are young, some of them are older, but who are really interested in the history of the Soviet Union and are interested in learning the truth about it and interested in my research. So sure, I'm basically that's my main audience. But in the United States, where the left has never been big, the communist movement was never very large. I'm gratified to get some young people involved. In the United States, and I guess in Western Europe, in much of Western Europe, the Trotskyist movement is actually much more influential, has more influence than any of the communist parties, any of the communist movements. And I think that's because the Trotskyists basically repeat all of the anti-Stalin and therefore anti-Soviet lies that the openly pro-capitalist anti-communists repeat. They're just a sounding board. They're just an echo chamber. They repeat those lies. And so the Trotskyists, there are Trotskyist professors in history departments in the United States. You will not find a single academic professor who could be described as pro-Stalin in any way in American universities, but there are quite a number of Trotskyist professors. And I think the same thing is true in the UK. And it may be true elsewhere too. But in Europe, there are more communist people like yourself who are interested in the history of the Soviet Union and finding out the truth about it. And that's really where I come in. You know, I would be useless, and I would do it. But even if I did do it, it would be useless for me to sort of, try to apologize for Stalin. Come up with defenses of his crimes, and that's what I'm accused of doing. But I don't do that, and that's why I don't call myself a Stalinist. Uh, I'm not a Stalinist like the Trotskyists or Trotskyists, right? Trotskyists defend Trotsky no matter what he said or did, and they deny a lot of what he did. But I'm not a Stalinist in that sense. I'm after the truth, and I think that ultimately that's the only position that you can take that's consistent with Marxism, right? Marx said, doubt everything, question everything. Marx was after the truth, and one of the, to the credit of the communist movement around the world, Marxists have been those who have been trying to discover the truth and strip away the mythologies and the lies that are spread by the exploiters everywhere. So it's an honorable thing to do, to look for the truth.
I would like to say two things. Firstly, that in the time of the new strategy of the imperialism, the strategy of the color revolution, the
Yes.
Trotskyist movement is very useful for the imperialism, for the NATO, because it's like a fight with the boxer fight in the ring, that you can't fight only with right hand, you also need left hand, and to attack all these cruel dictator, the Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, the barbar, you need to Lukashenko, Putin, and stuff like this. You need to guy who will say something about class struggle, about the exploitation, about the workers, and if we see how the colored revolution is started, for example, in the Ukraine or in the Arab Spring, it is starting from the leftist slogans. The workers don't have money, stuff like this. But sooner or later, it's always finished by the spreading imperialist interests. So it's the first thing which I wanted to say. And second thing is that in the history of the revolutionary movement in the 19th century, before October Revolution, before Bolshevik party, there was also a Stalin in 19th century, but this Stalin named was Jacobin, and all the revolutionary movement, they tried to compare to French Revolution and to Jacobins and to Robespierre, and said, oh, all revolution is finished by the terror, by the blood, by the the bourgeoisie can't accept that there can be the legitimate revolutionary movement. They always have to repeat it. Revolution is a violence, millions of death, blood, and stuff like this. And after October Revolution, they change Jacobin to Lenin, and after Lenin to Stalin. But because it is also very funny that in the first years of the October Revolution, the biggest enemy was Lenin. But after they changed Lenin to Stalin and started to promote the idea, Lenin was not so bad, Stalin is worse. It's
Yeah, Lenin was not so bad because supposedly at the end of his life, right? Supposedly at the end of his life, he attacked Stalin and said that Trotsky should become the leader of the party. My last book, the most recently published book, which was published in May of 2022, is about exactly that. It's a study of the last writings, the so-called Testament of Lenin, I don't know if you're familiar with that book of mine. If not,
No, 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 I am not familiar.
well, I will send you a copy of it. But it turns out that this is that a Russian scholar who belongs to I believe he belongs to the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is the largest, uh, party that calls itself a communist party in Russia. And he was a professor at Moscow University. Uh, in the 1990s, after the end of the Soviet Union, he got permission because of his position to get into the Lenin archive, and he studied, was allowed to study the manuscripts, the actual documents themselves of Lenin's last writings. And he came to the conclusion that um, the anti-Stalin writings, uh, the ones that are critical of Stalin, in the so-called Testament of Lenin, the documents that Lenin wrote from December 1922 until March 1923, are forgeries. And he wrote this up. His name is Valentin Sakharov. Have you ever heard of him?
No, no, no. About him, no, but I have your. Now I am into contact with comrade Alexei Novitsky, and he know a lot of historian from Russia. I speak Russian, so I make some interview now with Russian comrades, and
Okay,
all.
good, good.
And also, I hope that sooner or later, all the good Russian historian who make the same job like you in other front, I also have the possibility to speak with them and promote, because in Poland it's nothing. There are no any intellectual who are serious about the. Um, asking question, take
Sure.
take the black book of the communism and ask question, it's true or false, and no, they take it like a bible. Everything is everything here is
Even the
true.
academic, okay, so even the anti-communist academic historians in the United States never, ever cite the Black Book of Communism. I just want you to know that, okay? None of these here, even though they're not pro-communist, they're certainly not pro-Stalin, none of them would ever cite the Black Book of Communism. I read a lot of their material. They never cite it. That book is a disgrace. But of course, it wasn't meant to impress the academic historians. It was meant as propaganda among the intellectuals, people who read 500-page books, right? And people who do book reviews and people who write for magazines and newspapers. It was meant to provide a reference, a footnote, a source for anti-communist and anti-Stalin statements. You need to have they need to have sources like that they can say, oh well, a journalist can't do research. A journalist needs a source. Oh, well, the source is the Black Book of Communism, but it's never cited by serious historians. I just thought I'd let you know that. By the way, an interesting.
Wait, I will say some joke, because one comrade of me he find an interview with some Polish historian. He very popular. He was very often invited to some media, and always speaking about the crimes of the communism. And and he makes some montage that one time he said that it is 20 million of death, after 30 million of death, 25. Even this guy, he is an expert, but every time when he spoke about the crimes of Soviet Union, crimes of Stalin, crimes of communism, every time the number is changed.
Number changes. The number changes. It's a rubber number. Okay, you want it to whatever shape you want it. You just say it. I know it's all nonsense, and they, in some sense or other, they must know it's nonsense. But
And
anyway,
And also when we take this black book of the communism, there is a number of 65 million deaths in China. And why it is 65? Because firstly they make something and it was 35, so they they add 65 to have 100 million.
Yeah, no, it's that. Yeah, but that's yes, we're dealing with that issue. Okay, that the mass media have to have sources. Their reporters and their magazine writers and so forth have to have sources. So they need to be provided with these bogus sources that they can quote. Um, but we who are interested in the truth, have only the truth to combat that stuff with. I know things are very difficult in Poland. I just want to show you something. Okay, so so here's my book about Katyn. All right.
The mystery of the Katyń massacre, the evidence, the solution.
Okay, that's my book about Katyn. Now, here's the Polish translation.
Tajemnice zbrodni katyńskiej, dowody rozwiązania. But it is published?
Yeah, sure. Here in the state, here in the United States.
But not in Poland.
No. Okay. So the the gentleman who translated this, okay, voluntarily, right? He's a Polish communist. I don't know. You probably know who he is. He contacted me a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and so forth. And we exchanged emails, and he said, "I want to translate your book into Polish." He translated it into Polish. He then went to a number of bookstores. I don't know exactly which bookstores in Poland, and I don't know in exactly which towns, which cities. But he said he went to a number, and he asked if they'd carry copies of the book, and they said no, we won't do it. Not because we don't like controversy, we like controversy, but we're afraid that we might be prosecuted by the government because it's not clear exactly what is meant by the prohibition to spread communism. Okay, they're not sure. So they said, because we're not sure that we won't get prosecuted if we carry your book, we're not going to carry it. So there is a website where you can download the Polish translation of my book, this one here. But I've also got it published in a publisher here in the United States, and obviously, it's not that many people who are going to buy it here in the United States because it's in Polish. But sometimes I have students. Anyway, I got it published. But basically, it's you can download it from the internet. And after our talk here, I'll send you the link that where you can download that book. And I also, that same book, my Katyn book, is published in France.
I know, Comrade Emmerich. It's the Comrade Emmerich, Emmerich Monville. It's his comrade. I know him very well. He speak I think 15 language, Emmerich.
Yeah, he's and I don't know if you've heard of this, but a communist in the Czech Republic, okay, named Josef Skala. Have you heard about his case?
Yes. He was, I don't know, arrested or something like this.
Just sentenced because in a radio program, I believe it was a radio program, he mentioned that there is some doubt about whether the Soviets had killed the Polish prisoners at Katyn, and he cited one of my articles that's on my webpage. And for this, he was prosecuted, and a few weeks ago, he was sentenced to 8 months in prison, but they're suspended. He doesn't have to go to prison as long as he doesn't do it again for the next 5 years. Okay.
Yes, but if we talk about the persecution about Katyn, I also am a victim. I recorded 3 videos where I expose your main thought about the Katyń massacre. And the Instytut Pamięci Narodowej, the Institute of the National Remembrance, they are the guy who can work like a procurator, and he accused me that I deny the Katyn massacre. I don't deny. I said that it's the German, so it's a difference. So they accused me, and it is serious crime because it is 2 years of prison. But because I am living in France, in December I have a letter from Poland that you committed a crime, but in France this is not a crime, so this case is closed.
Yeah, we won't prosecute you, but don't do it in Poland, right? For Christmas when you go home.
It is why now I'm talking with you in English language, not in Polish. So maybe they will not persecute me, but we'll translate it. We'll translate it to Polish. And of course, all the links with all with the PDF in the book in the PDF, or also how to buy this book from USA. It's very funny from Polish perspective because Poland love America. We loved USA. So if in USA there is a book about Katyn, we will buy it. And also, I would like to say another very funny thing. That
Whoops.
hello?
Yeah, I know something happened. I didn't do that. There we go.
Oh. And I would like to say one very funny thing, that Polish is an anti-communist country, which the anti-communist propaganda in Poland is forbidden, but Poland is the cheapest country in European Union. And the leftist, Marxist publisher from West countries, from Germany, from France, from other countries like this, they publish their books in Poland and after export to France. So it's a paradox.
Yeah, sure it is, of course. I just wanted to show you one more thing. Joseph Skala, as I mentioned to you, in the Czech Republic was prosecuted, and at almost the same time as he was prosecuted, like last February, my book on Katyn came out in Czech, in the Czech language.
Zahada masakry w Katyni.
So somehow or other, this publisher, Torden, is not prosecuted. He published this book, but Joseph Skala gets prosecuted. I don't understand how that. I mean, that's fine with me, but I don't understand how they.
But you know him, this Joseph Skala?
No, I don't know him, but I read about it on the internet. You know, people send.
I will try to contact him, and if he speak Russian or English or French, I will speak with him.
But I mean, it just seems strange to me that they published this book. Well, actually, this book. Now that I think about it, this book is Torden Publishers. May not be published in Czech Republic, and maybe it's published in Slovakia. I'm not sure. But in any case, it's the same. It's the same book. And so here you have the book published, and that seems to be all right. The publisher published it, but this gentleman got into trouble. Anyway, I got into a little trouble too. The same organization that contacted you, the Institute of Popular History or People's History or whatever it's called, you know. The head of that organization sent a letter to my university and to the trustees of my university complaining about me that I, you know, published this book and published these articles and denied the Katyn massacre. But my university doesn't care about that because, you know, they don't care.
And are you capable to read Polish in loud?
I can read Polish. I just can't speak it. I have no reason to speak it. Read it, sure. I studied Polish. I had to study Polish to, well, I had to study Polish to write the book about Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, because that a lot of that Timothy Snyder, who teaches at Yale, is a terrible anti-communist liar. But he published this book called Bloodlands, which I think in Polish is something like Shavi Zimni, something like that, right? Shavia Zimni. Anyway, it's published in Poland, and he is basically an expert in Poland. Polish history. He's not basically an expert in Soviet history, so he uses a lot of Polish evidence. And in order to study his book and to read the sources and so forth, I had to learn enough Polish to be able to do that. And it wasn't hard. I know Russian, so it's another Slavic language. It's not the same thing, but it's related. The basic grammar is pretty similar. So yeah, I learned enough Polish to be able to read historical documents, but I don't speak it. I have no reason to speak it, so it's just a reading knowledge. But yeah, it was important there, and of course, in a secondary way, it became important in writing this book on Katyn, because there are a few documents in Polish that are relevant. Mostly they're in German or Russian, but there are a few documents in Polish that are relevant. And I had to study those pretty carefully, and I critiqued those documents in my book too. I got the originals, the Polish language, and studied them, and that's an important part of my research on Katyn, sure.
Now let's move on the Katyń massacre. I hope that our conversation will be listened to by people from Poland who have never heard of you before, who have not read any of your books. So I am asking you to answer the most important question. Who and when murdered the Polish officers who were taken prisoner by the Soviets in September 1949? Please take your time and tell us what really happened and what is the state of our knowledge.
Okay, just let me tell you. Okay, so let's start with the state of our knowledge. I examined the evidence that has been discovered by others. I didn't go to Poland and start digging up, or to Russia and start digging up graves and rummaging around libraries. So I studied the evidence that is publicly available. That evidence makes it clear that the Soviets did not do it. Now, if the Soviets didn't kill the Poles, there's only one other party that could have killed the Poles, and that's the Germans. So what I did not do is go to, let's say, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and get all of the documents from the various German military units that moved into Soviet Russia in 1941 and see where they were and which ones did this and which ones did that. So I didn't find the German unit that killed the Polish prisoners at what we now call Katyn. What I did was examine the evidence that already exists and make it and show that evidence is there's no question that it's not consistent with Soviet guilt. And the way I went about it is this: there are definitely some forgeries, some fake documents involved, because there are documents that the Soviets uncovered in the later part of the war that tend to show that the Germans were guilty. There are documents that the Germans turned up earlier in the war that tend to show that the Soviets were guilty. And then there are some other documents too that came to light since then. Not all of these documents can be true, of course, right? You can't have it both ways. You can't have the documents that show Soviet guilt to be genuine, and you can't have documents that show Nazi guilt genuine at the same time. Some of these documents must be forgeries, must be fakes. So I took all of the evidence after I'd studied it and divided it into two groups. The evidence that might possibly be fake, might possibly have been forged. And then there's a much smaller amount of evidence that could not possibly have been forged. So the evidence that might have been forged includes, for example, all confessions, because we have confessions from people who say that the Soviets did it. We have confessions from people who say that the Germans did it. There's no way to decide which of those are accurate just on the basis of those confessions. So you have to set those aside. You have to look for documents that could not possibly have been forged. And that's what I did. So I found a number of documents that could not have been forged. And it's clear that in all of those cases, they exclude Soviet guilt. Then I examined the major documents that supposedly proved Soviet guilt, like the German report. And the German report, as I discovered, is, on the one hand, it's crucial to the position that the Soviets were guilty. The position that the Soviets were guilty relies very heavily on the German report, which was published in 1943. And so I studied the German report, and it's full of contradictions and false statements. So I demonstrate that in my book. There are some other documents that supposedly show Soviet guilt, and I studied those as well. And then there's the Soviet report, the Burdenko report of 1944, January 1944, which states with evidence, with its own evidence, that the Soviets were innocent, that the Germans were guilty. So I studied the Burdenko report too, to see if there are problems or evidence of falsification with it. But there aren't any. Then there are a few other documents, some of which are pretty important. For example, the daughter of the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, whose name was Kathleen Harriman. She was a young woman. She came with her father to Katyn in 1940, actually maybe the end of 1940. When the Soviets were studying the bodies. They dug up the bodies again, some of them, and studied the bodies. And she was present when a document was taken from the body, from one of these corpses. The document was dated in the summer of 1941. I'm sorry, in the summer of 1941. In the summer of 1941. So therefore, it could not have been, this person could not have been killed by the Soviets in the spring of 1940, because if these Poles were killed by the Soviets, it had to have been in the spring of 1940. By the summer of 1941, the Germans were occupying this area, okay, because the German invasion started in June 1941. So there are a few scattered documents that are pretty important, but I investigated all of the major collections of documents. But the first thing I did was to try to determine which documents could not possibly have been faked. And those are documents that either the side, the German or the Soviets, published that they would not have published if they could not if they could have avoided it, somehow or other they decided they couldn't avoid it, or documents that were published but that neither side thought were very important and therefore they neglected them. A good example of the first is that all of the bullets, all of the shell casings discovered in Katyn are of German shells. Okay? Now, if the Germans had not shot the Poles, if it was the Soviets who had shot the Poles, there certainly might be some German shells there. Maybe the Soviets used some German weapons, but there certainly would have been some Soviet shells as well. And we have a control. We have some other massacres that the Germans committed that are well documented, German atrocities where excavations have turned up shells, and they're always German shells. So this could not have been faked. The Germans would not have put German shells into the graves at Katyn. Therefore, those shells must have actually been found by the Germans there. And there are a couple of other examples of that. Then I studied the lists that the Germans made of the Poles whose bodies they found at Katyn, or they said they found. Actually, it's not as simple as that. The bodies had been in the ground so long that they were not recognizable. Okay, the decay had gone way too far. So the Germans identified or claimed to identify Polish bodies based upon scraps of paper that were also found in the graves. And some of these scraps of paper can be shown to come from Polish prisoners who were not at Katyn. They were not at the prison camp near Katyn. So therefore, but they were at other prison camps. So therefore, the story that the official story that the prisoners were shipped out of their 3 prisoner of war camps to the nearest city and they're shot by the NKVD cannot be true, because some of those soldiers who were shipped out of either Katyń, which is now called Tver, or out of Kharkov, which is now in Ukraine, but at that time was in the Soviet Union, turned up, their papers turned up at Katyn. There are some other cases like this. There was a Soviet partisan group in the summer of 1943 who sent a report back to Moscow about what was going on in that area. And they mentioned that the Germans had gone to some cemeteries in the area and dug up dead bodies and put them in trucks, hauled them off to Katyn and put them in the graves. So, that's, so there is some other evidence, but the most important evidence was the evidence that can't have been forged. The Germans would never put German shells in the among the graves at Katyn, and there are some other examples like that. So there's no evidence that actually points to Soviet guilt, but there's quite a bit of evidence that points to German guilt, and that's what my book concludes.
Thank you very much, but I would like to dig deeper in this subject. Okay, so I would like say something from Poland perspective, that we have a very strange situation in Poland, that some very tragic event in the time of the Second World War. Now they are trying to, in the same time, don't talk about the German crimes and talk about so-called Soviet crimes. The better example is the Warsaw Uprising. Warsaw Uprising it is very tragic history when the Nazis from Germany, but also collaborators, for example, from Ukraine, destroyed the insurrection, and after destroy all the city and killed a lot of Poles, more than 2,100,000. And it is one of the cruel crimes in all the history of the Second World War. But if now we are listening the commemoration of the Warsaw Uprising in 1st of August every year, they say very little about the Nazis' crimes. They said about the Soviet that it is all fault of the Stalin, because Stalin, he didn't help of the Warsaw Uprising. It is the treason of and he betrayed and stuff like this. It's all the time when there is some possibility to attack Soviet Union, and in the same time they forget to say something about the Nazis, or they even don't say that. The Katyn example is the best way that how to, in the same time, not to talk about the Nazis' crimes, and try to make these crimes to the responsibility of the Soviet Union. Or if it is not possible, they try, okay, it's Stalin who betrayed. Because if it is possible, and maybe because the history of Poland changed all the time. I am old enough to I was born in socialist Poland. Maybe I have 7 years when the socialist Poland was finished. But the books from the socialist Poland were in the schools a few years in the capitalist Poland. So I remember what was the history of Poland in 1990s, what was the history Poland 10 years later, and what is the history Poland now. This history is changed all the time. The history of Second World War is changed all the time. It is the same war, but if you take the book which was written in 1980s and now, it's totally different. And the most tragic thing is these guys who are in the one books, the liberated people, the people who liberated us, and it's not liberation, because without Soviet Union there will be the extermination of Polish nation, extermination Polish culture, Polish language. It was written in the plan of the Hitler and other guys that the goal of this war is to make this area only for Germans, and so it is not a liberation. It's I don't have a word, but we are living with because of the help of the Soviet Union.
Okay, so just let me say a few words about that. Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Yes, okay. So I studied and wrote about the Warsaw Uprising when I wrote my book Blood Lies, which is a critique of Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands. Snyder's book was translated into Polish and published in Poland, of course, as well. My book has not been published in Poland, but I did write about this, and of course, Snyder has it all. Snyder repeats the Polish government's current position that it's all the Soviets are to blame. You should probably know, so I will send you a copy of that. You should know. Remember General Anders?
Yes.
That name. General Anders said that the Warsaw Uprising was a crime, not a Soviet crime, a Polish crime, a crime by the Polish government, a crime by the commander of the Komorowski.
Yeah, Komorowski.
Of the Polish Home Army, the Polish Armia Krajowa, because he declared the uprising, even though he found out He gave the order for the uprising because he had been given false information that the Soviet tanks had crossed the Wisla River, and they had not crossed the Wisla River. And then he gave the order for the uprising to begin. One of his officers came in and said, we were wrong. The Soviets had been stopped on the east side of the Wisla River, but Komarovsky did not stop the uprising. And not only did General Anderson hated the Soviets, he hated Stalin. Anders was convinced that the Soviets killed the prisoners in Poland. But Anders said that this was a crime. It was a crime by the Polish government in exile in London and by Komarovsky to declare this, because there was no chance that the uprising could succeed unless it was coordinated with the Red Army. There was no chance that the Polish rebels in Warsaw could defeat all of these German troops, heavily armed German troops. They had a couple of panzer divisions there, as well as other troops. And then there was a historian who was also alive. I think he was a teenager at the time, named Jan Cechanowski, who's fairly well known. He's dead now, but a fairly well known Polish author and historian. And he also called the uprising. He was in the uprising. He was a teenager, but he was in the uprising. He said, yes, it was a crime. So the problem with the contemporary Polish government, the post-Soviet Polish government, is that these people there was very little difference between that government, the Polish government before the war, and the German fascists. They were essentially a fascist government. They were very racist. They were very anti-working class. They were collaborating with the Nazis right up until the last possible moment. And this is the Polish government I'm talking about, right?
Yes, yes. They are taking the part of the Czechoslovakia, Zaolzie.
They took the Chechen area of Czechoslovakia. They collaborated with the Germans. They would have been very happy to join forces with the Germans, except Hitler had already decided by that time that he just wanted to get rid of Poland and get rid of the Poles. But they would have been very happy to join up forces with Hitler. One of their politicians told Hitler, we have the documentation, I'm sure you know this, that if Hitler would solve the Jewish problem in Poland, if he would, Hitler was talking about deporting the Jews to Africa or something like that, right? And this Polish politician said, if you do that, we'll build a statue to you, we'll build a statue in your honor in Warsaw.
Yes, it is ambassador in Berlin, Polish ambassador in Berlin.
Yeah, that's right. So the Polish government, then of course, the whole World War II wouldn't have started except for the Polish government. The Polish government refused to make a treaty, make a mutual defense pact with the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Okay, the British and the French weren't too keen about it, but they did ask the Poles, hey, if we make this treaty, this was in August 1939, if we make this treaty, we make this pact with the Soviets will put 1 million men in the field against the German army. But they need the Polish government's permission to enter Poland, because Germany and the Soviet Union didn't share a border. If the Soviet troops were supposed to get at the German army, they would have to enter Poland. And the Polish government said, we will never allow a Soviet soldier into Poland. So that meant there could be no collective security. That's what they called it at that time, right? There could be no treaty between the French, the British, and the Poles against the Soviet Union. This was in August 1939. That's why the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviets, because the Soviets had with the Germans, because the Soviets had no allies. They were afraid that if Germany attacked the Soviet Union, the British and the French might even join them. Hell, the Poles might even join them, might even join the Germans, and they might all attack the Soviet Union. And meanwhile, the Soviet Union was fighting a war in the Far East with Japan. The treaty for that wasn't signed until the middle of September 1939. So the Polish government was, as much as any other, of course, Hitler was responsible for World War II. Okay, let's not forget that. But as for the other powers, the Polish government was at least as responsible for World War II as the British and the French, who of course also failed to support Poland. Right, the British and the French signed this treaty in 1939 to support Poland, but they didn't do it. All right, Germany attacked Poland, and the British and the French said, "Oh, we'll declare war." But this became known as the phony war. In English, it's the phony war. In French, it's like guerre. Uh, uh, well, there's a French, la
Drôle de guerre.
Drôle de guerre, right? So, what kind of a war is this? They refused to fight, and clearly the Soviets understood very well. This was a way of saying to the Germans, to Hitler, "Okay, we're not gonna oppose you as long as you keep moving to the east, keep moving east, keep moving east, keep moving against the Soviets, move in that direction." So uh, that accounts. So that was the Polish government's fault, and then the Polish government collected itself in eastern Poland, uh, and on September the 17th, uh, crossed the border into Romania. So then Poland had no government. Okay, there was no state of Poland any longer because under international law, a state has to have a government. The Polish government crossed the border into Poland, and they didn't appoint a government in exile. This was on September the 17th. So the Germans, I have this in my book, the German general, the German ambassador told Molotov, told the Soviet foreign minister, if the Soviet Union doesn't send in the Red Army, other states could arise in eastern Poland. And General Halder, who is one of the overall commanders of the German forces, who kept a diary. We have Halder's diary. It's been published. Halder said that the Germans were talking, Hitler was talking about letting the Ukrainian nationalists form a government in eastern Poland, and of course the Soviets couldn't have ever agreed to that, right? So the Soviets sent in the troops on September the 17th because the Polish government had fled. The whole purpose of the secret codicil, the secret secret of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which divided Poland into spheres of influence, was to guarantee that if the Polish government was defeated, that Poland could continue to exist east of the Vistula River, east of the Narew and San rivers, right, which was the dividing line between the Soviet sphere of influence and the German sphere of influence. And so there could have been a rump Poland, a small, much smaller state of Poland, which the Soviets hoped would then be more reasonable, then be very anti-Hitler and be willing to join an alliance with Hitler. But instead of doing that, instead of forming a government in eastern Poland, the Polish government went into Romania, which at that time had a border with eastern Poland. And so there was no state any longer. And then, of course, during World War II itself, and particularly after the defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad, the Polish Home Army was told not to engage the Germans, not to fight the Germans. Save your forces for fighting the Soviets. And then they had Operacja Bursza. You know about Operacja
Bursza? Everybody in Poland knows this.
Bursza. And that's what caused the Warsaw Uprising. Warsaw Uprising was seen by Komorowski and by the London Polish government as a part of Operacja Bursza. The idea was to wait until the Red Army had driven the Germans out of a city, and then the Polish underground was to go in and seize the city hall, the mairie, right? The city hall, the post office, the telegraph office, and declare themselves the legal government, right? That was what Operacja Bursza was supposed to be about. So that was what was supposed to happen as far as the London Polish government was concerned in Warsaw. But the German army stopped the Soviet army on the banks of the Vistula River, and the Soviets tried to cross it. They were not successful, and therefore they had the brave people who rose up at Komorowski's command to carry out the Warsaw uprising had no Soviet support. They couldn't. They were never going to defeat the German army by themselves. Nevertheless, nevertheless, when the Polish forces finally surrendered, the Germans accepted their surrender and transported the Poles who had fought in the Polish and the Warsaw Uprising to prisoner of war camps. That means they treated them like regular soldiers instead of treating them like guerrillas, which if they treated them like guerrillas, they would have shot them all. So the Germans too knew that they had to, in some way or other, stimulate collaboration with the Poles in order to join forces against the Soviets. And that's where Katyn comes in. The Germans had an operation called Operation 1005, where after their defeat at Stalingrad, they went around to as many of the mass graves of the graves of the massive victims that the Germans had murdered, and they used prisoners, they used the local population to dig up the bodies, as many as they could, and burn them so as to burn the evidence of their atrocities. But when they got to Katyn, they got a different idea. They said, we can blame this on the Soviets. But that was what was going on at the time that in 1943 that the Germans arrived in Katyn and started digging up these bodies and claiming they were the bodies of people killed by the Soviets. It was at this time that the Polish government in exile was looking for ways to collaborate with the Germans because they knew that the Soviets were the real.
And it was a time of the uprising in the ghetto, Warsaw ghetto. So in the capital of Poland, we have uprising in the center, in the ghetto, and it is the time when the government, Poland in exile, starting to collaboration with Nazis.
The Polish government in exile, as I remember it, it's been a few years since I studied this. Polish government in exile actually told the commanders of the Home Army in Poland to collaborate to help the Jews in their uprising because they knew this would be very good publicity for the Polish cause. And the commanders of the Polish underground said, we can't do this. Our soldiers don't want to do this. They don't want to collaborate with the Jews. They don't want to work with the Jews. We refuse to do that. We don't consider the Jews to be Poles. So they were not able to, the Polish Home Army was not able to, the Polish government in exile was not able to convince the Polish Home Army to give very much support. I think they smuggled a few arms in. They were not able to give them very much support because the Polish Home Army was tremendously anti-Semitic. They were racist against the Jews, just like the Germans were. And then the whole business in Poland about the Poles bribing Jews so as not to tell the Germans, and what do they call it?
Schmalzownik.
Schmalzownik, yeah. There was that whole phenomenon too, right? So there was a tremendous amount of there was more anti-Semitism in Poland than there was in Germany. Let's put it that way.
Yes, okay. But it was an economic reason because when the occupation was started, they expulsed all the Jews from their homes, and these homes was empty. And the Polish settled in these homes, and they knew that if the Jews will be liberated, they will take our homes. So it was very good planified by the Germans how to make this in the occupation society, divide this society. One part close in the ghetto, and second part profited it in the material way.
Yeah, and then of course there was the terrorism after the war. The Polish Home Army was commanded by the London government in exile because Churchill made them do it. Right? Churchill said, "You got to tell the Polish Home Army to stand down," right? Because the British and the French recognized the pro-Soviet Polish government. Okay, so they But the Polish Home Army, the Polish government, the London government in exile, evidently told the Polish Home Army not to do it, because many of them then went underground and they became guerrilla fighters against the Soviets, particularly in eastern Poland, right? What had been eastern Poland, which was now the Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. And these people became terrorists, and they continued to assassinate Red Army soldiers and communists and Polish communists and so forth, right up until the 1950s. All right, these are the so-called
Żołnierze wyklęci.
yes.
Yes,
That's
the cursed soldiers. Yes, but the Armia Krajowa was how to say finished in January 45. It was the decision, and some of the people, I think the majority of the members of the Armia Krajowa, also people from my family, they they started normal life. They became students or members of party. They starting to rebuild and many soldiers from Armia Krajowa became soldiers of the Wojsko Polskie. And without Wojsko Polskie, they go to the Berlin. And in the fight in the Berlin, they have some experience from Warsaw. But of course, there are other guys from Armia Krajowa who started all this terrorist activity.
Yeah, like Pilecki.
Yes.
Probably know Pilecki. They make a big hero out of Pilecki because, he did smuggle himself into the Warsaw Ghetto and come out and issues this report.
No, it's false. Nobody that he was in Auschwitz, that he was volunteer to the Auschwitz. No, it's not existing something like volunteer, because you never know what they do with you.
Yeah, sure. But he then continued to fight against the Soviets and against the pro-communist Poles. After the war, he became a terrorist. And that's why the Soviets arrested him and put him and a bunch of others on trial. He was the only one they executed. They imprisoned all of his co-defendants. But it's often said that the Soviets, by the anti-communists, that the Soviets killed him, and he was such a hero. Well, he did this heroic thing in Ossetia, as you said, but he was a terrorist. He did not surrender. He did not give up his arms when the London Polish government told him to. So he didn't represent a government. And if you're fighting and you don't represent a government, you're a terrorist. Legally speaking, that's what he was. So there's this. Okay, so the current Polish government after 1990 or whenever it was, uh, uh, that replaced the pro-Soviet Polish government, is they 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 look to the pre-war Polish regime, pre-war Polish government as their ancestors, their they consider themselves the successors of these people, and these are all very right wing, almost fascist people, and so it's not really surprising that the Polish government, ever since the independent Poland, has been super anti-communist, uh, right wing politics, and extremely, of course, anti-Russian, extremely anti-communist, and that's the roots of how they happen to get there, happen to get there, and of course, it's in their interest to say that the Soviets never liberated Poland. Evidently, in their view, in the view of the anti-communists, only capitalists can liberate you, right? Communists can never liberate you. Okay, only capitalists are capable of liberating. So the Americans liberated the French, so therefore the French were liberated. But Poles were liberated. The Poles were freed by the Soviets, and therefore they were never liberated. So this is the kind of phony history, very dangerous phony history that's spread not only in Poland but in different degrees, all around the world. Certainly in the United States as well. This is the version of history that gets taught in the schools and that most people get acquainted with. Therefore, they don't know the truth. They only know these anti-communist and anti-Stalin lies.
Unfortunately, Poles also don't know the truth today, because the older generation, some of them remember. The most important things is that, from my perspective, Warsaw Uprising was not against Germany and even not against Soviet Union. Warsaw Uprising was against the Polish government, which was created in 2022 of July. So 8 day before, in Lublin, there was created the Polish Socialist government.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay,
And
yeah.
and it was the decision that and the question of liberation. They didn't want it that Soviet Union and the socialist government liberated Warsaw, so they preferred destroy Warsaw and kill all this. And Bor Komorowski, when he was in exile, and he was he thought he talked openly that because of the Warsaw Uprising, Polish society will always hate the Soviets.
Yep.
My goal was good. I won this because he's psychopath who who wanted to destroy the Polish capital and thousands of Poles and all these. Some of the things which was destroyed will never come back, because the Warsaw was rebuilt, but their archive, the bibliotheques, all these things, it was destroyed in the fire. And
Yeah, sure. And this was because of the Polish government. That's right. The Polish government in exile. And Bor Komorowski. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, do you have a copy of my book, Blood Lies? The one that I talked to?
No. I don't
I,
have copy of your book, and I need to say that in last month I was so occupied by the war in Ukraine that I have a lot of things which I is waiting for the better time when I have to because all in my mind all the time I lose it's very important for Poland, because Poland is the second after Ukraine to send the when the Ukrainians will be defeated, and the imperialists will push Poles to continue this stupid war. So in the last months. I was organized. I tried to organize some anti-war movement against sending weapon to Ukraine, against involving Poland in this war, and so there are a lot of things which I didn't read. I
of
didn't.
course, of course. Yeah, you're right in the middle of things there. We're much further removed. You know, the American government, the American ruling class is very happy, right? They're selling all these arms to the Ukrainians. The arms manufacturers are making a fortune. They're making a lot of money. The American taxpayers are paying for it. They bond the the pipeline, the natural gas pipeline, and now Europeans have to buy natural gas from the United States. So the American petroleum companies are making a lot more money than they were making before. This war has been very good business for American capitalists, and of course, it helps to weaken Russia, which is apparently what the American government wants to do, and
But
solidifies
without
so,
success.
without
I
success.
think the Russia is stronger now.
Well,
Not
yeah,
military, but they now we have all this international coalition against NATO. We see that in last days we have the peace agreement between Saudi and Iran, that many countries want to join BRICS, that they started to not trade in the dollar. So from economic perspective, it isn't success for the USA. And in last days, we have also the banking crisis, which is started in USA.
Yeah, they wanted it to be a success, but it wasn't. I mean, look at the United States has invaded Iraq, invaded Afghanistan. They they were not successful in either of those efforts, but they killed an awful lot of people. The United States military killed an awful lot of people. Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, and a lot of people are being killed in this war in Ukraine. And you know, the United States, even when it fails, it causes a tremendous amount of damage, and that's what's going on now with this Ukraine.
And
So
what do you think about the Ukrainian propaganda today? Because I am, it's in one finger, a small finger, we see all these all these lies which were repeated in the against Soviet Union, against Stalin, and that the example of primitivity of the Ukrainian propaganda, and which is repeated without any question in Poland, and I think also in other Western countries. It's very good example for us, which we want to deconstruct this anti-communist propaganda. But the same people who before organized anti-communist propaganda, now they organize this very
anti
funny.
anti-Russian propaganda. Yes, you're right. That's what's happening in the United States. In the American mass media, there are no voices permitted that will oppose the United States government NATO position that Russia is the aggressor. And the situation in Ukraine is not spelled out, not clarified in the mass media, and I must say in academia either. The latest story that I saw last night, and it's in the news today, is the International Court of Justice at The Hague has.
Yes, yes, I know. No.
Here's my take on it. Okay, for deporting Ukrainian children to Russia. But here's the story. What they don't explain is that um, the in eastern Ukraine, uh, people who live in eastern Ukraine may have been, may still be Ukrainian citizens, but most of them are Russians. Okay, Ukraine. If there is such a thing as Ukrainian nationality, it's people who speak Ukrainian, the Ukrainian language from birth, people whose parents speak Ukrainian, and therefore Ukrainian is their first language. And those people are mainly in the West, although there are some Ukrainians elsewhere. But in the East, these people are not ethnic Ukrainians. These are not people who speak Ukrainian from birth. These are Russians, and the Russians regard them as Russians. The people in the eastern oblasts like Donetsk and Lugansk, uh, which have seceded from Ukraine, and now Russia has declared that they're part of Russia. Pardon me, they don't regard themselves as Ukrainians. And certainly, these children are Russian children. They may be, their parents may be Russians, may be Ukrainian citizens, or they may have been citizens before 2014, but they're not really Ukrainians. And so this whole story of Russia deporting Ukrainian children into Russia is really not clarified. It's not explained just what the situation here is. It's as though somehow or other Russia has gone to The View and is taking children away from Ukrainians in Western Ukraine. And of course, that's not the case at all. So it's all a big propaganda barrage. There's a lot of disagreement on the left, broadly speaking, left in the United States. Pardon me. Some people support Ukraine. Some people support Russia. And some people attempt to take a Leninist view and oppose imperialism generally. But Lenin always said, oppose your own government first and foremost, right? So oppose the United States, oppose NATO most of all. So there's a lot of disagreement in the what you might call the broadly speaking the left in the United States over the Ukraine war. But I would say that most people on the left do not support the United States and NATO simply because if you're in the United States and you're on the left, you basically are used to the idea that the United States is never on the right side. They're just never on the right side. That's a knee-jerk reaction. You really need to think it out and get the details. But the United States is never supporting the right side in any conflict. So I think that most people have learned their lesson not to support whatever side the United States is supporting. But a few people.
I think the people who support Ukraine are not in left. It's something which expels you from the left, because supporting Ukraine, it's supporting state, Nazi states, which is whereas we have a lot of law anti-workers, anti-trade unions, anti-left.
Oh yeah. Ukraine is all of that information about Ukraine. You can find it if you look for it, but it's never in the mass media. I mean, I only have time to read the New York Times. I can't read. I have to do research. I have to teach. I can't be reading 3 or 4 newspapers a day. So I read the New York Times. It's never in the New York Times. You never find this kind of context, this kind of historical background. You never find the actual facts of what's going on. It's all propaganda. I remember the Vietnam War, the early years of the Vietnam War, the 1960s in the United States. And the American newspapers today about the war in Ukraine, are just like they were in the middle years of the 1960s. It's all pro-American propaganda. You don't get any real facts. You can't tell really what's going on. It's really it's very dramatic. It's very obvious.
Professor Furr, it was a pleasure for me to speaking with you. I hope that we will continue our discussion, because discussing this question with you is very, very important for me, and it is also a pleasure to speak with somebody.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I will email you the link where you can share it among your people, among your friends, where you can download the PDF of my Polish book. And if you want me to mail you some of these, send me a mailing address and I'll send you some. But, it's kind of expensive. I can't send a lot of them. I think the best thing to do is to try to reproduce them from the PDF that I'll be sending. But you can spread it as you can, because we need that. I have Polish American students, and I've been giving some of the students we have here at my university in Poland, I've been giving them copies of this book. So that's really what I do. So I'll send you the link and let's stay in touch.
Okay. Thank you very much one more time.